It was my second day at the seaside resort, and I was finally starting to feel the tension of the past year melt away. The warm sun, the salty air, and the promise of time to myself were exactly what I needed after months of relentless work and a couple of breakups that had left me questioning everything. I came here for solitude, for the chance to reset, but as I was about to learn, the universe had other plans. The resort was postcard perfect. Soft white beaches stretching endlessly, crystal clear water sparkling under the sun, and a soothing vibe that seemed to say, "Leave your troubles behind. They don't belong here." But little did I know this trip would leave me with memories far beyond the picturesque views. On my third morning, after a quick breakfast, I decided to hit the pool instead of the beach. It was quiet, the kind of peaceful you'd expect mid-morning, with only a handful of people lounging around. I stepped into the water, relishing the coolness against my skin. That's when I noticed them. Two guys around my age at the far end of the pool. They were laughing, splashing each other like carefree kids on summer break. The taller one, Alex, had the kind of effortless confidence that made you look twice. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his lean but muscular frame moved with a natural grace. The other guy, Ben, was shorter, with a quieter energy. His lean build and thoughtful expression made him seem like the kind of person who noticed everything but said little. I caught their eyes a few times, and Alex was the first to smile, a wide, inviting grin that crinkled his eyes in a way that instantly put you at ease. Ben followed with a softer, more uncertain smile. It felt like they were sizing me up, or maybe that was just my imagination. I nodded back politely, giving a small smile of my own before slipping under the water. Later that afternoon, I ran into them again, this time at the beach bar. It felt like fate, or at least the kind of coincidence you don't question when you're on vacation. We started talking, exchanging the usual traveler pleasantries, where we were from, how long we were staying, what we'd done so far. Alex was easygoing, the conversational leader, while Ben spoke less but watched more. It was the kind of balance you find between close friends, Alex's confidence filling the spaces where Ben's quietness might have created an awkward pause, but there was something in the way Ben's eyes lingered on me, just a fraction too long, that made me wonder if there was more beneath the surface. As the evening stretched on, the atmosphere grew looser. A few drinks in, Ben pulled me aside while Alex was chatting with the bartender. He leaned in closer, his voice low. "You know," he said, his lips curling into a small, almost shy smile, "I'm not like Alex." It hung there between us, a puzzle I was meant to solve. I studied his face for a second, the faint flush on his cheeks, the way his eyes darted nervously but always came back to me. It clicked. I didn't press him to say more. There was no need. The unspoken tension between us suddenly made sense, and I had a feeling that whatever he wasn't saying yet, we'd get to it eventually. The next day we ended up back at the pool. It was one of those lazy vacation afternoons where the hours blurred together in a haze of sun and water. Alex, ever the showman, was doing laps, his strong strokes cutting cleanly through the water. Ben and I stayed in the shallow end, letting the conversation flow as naturally as the waves lapping at the pool's edge. We talked about our lives back home, relationships, and the things that had brought us to this sunlit escape. The unspoken pull between us grew stronger with every passing minute. At one point, Alex swam over, his wet hair sticking to his forehead. He playfully splashed Ben, who laughed and retaliated with a half-hearted wave of water. It was all light-hearted fun until Ben shifted closer to me under the water. I felt it first, a light brush against my side, then his arm sliding around my waist. The touch was gentle but deliberate, and I froze for a moment, my pulse hammering in my chest. Alex, oblivious, was still recounting some story from their flight. Ben's fingers lingered, brushing my skin just below the water's surface. When our eyes met, his gaze was steady, searching mine for a reaction. I didn't pull away. When Alex swam off to the other side of the pool, Ben and I drifted toward the deeper end, where the water was darker, quieter and more private. Out of sight from the others, Ben's hand moved lower, his touch more assured now. My breath hitched, my skin tingling from the thrill of it. There was something undeniably electric about the moment. The public setting, the hidden intimacy, the unspoken promises in his touch. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the water in hues of gold and amber. But even as the day wound down, the connection between us felt unfinished, like an unlit fuse waiting for the right spark. That night, after dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about Ben. The brief contact, the quiet understanding in his eyes, it all played over in my mind like a scene from a movie. When I returned to my room, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Ben standing there, his expression a mix of nervousness and resolve. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. I stepped aside, my pulse quickening as he crossed the threshold. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. He hesitated for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, then stepped closer. "About earlier," he started, his voice low. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Neither could I, but before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was both tentative and filled with urgency. Whatever walls had been between us earlier crumbled in that moment, leaving only the raw, unfiltered connection that had been building since we first met. This wasn't just a vacation anymore. It was something far more unexpected, far more unforgettable. The rest of the day after the pool was a blur. Ben and I dried off and joined Alex, who had returned to his sun lounger, oblivious to what had just happened. He was chatting casually about dinner plans, the same carefree vibe he always carried, while Ben and I exchanged fleeting glances, the weight of our secret thick in the air. A few minutes later, Ben stood excusing himself. "Forgot something in the room, be right back." He looked at me then, a quick flick of his eyes, subtle but deliberate. A silent invitation. I hesitated, my pulse quickening as I debated whether to follow him. Would Alex notice? Would it matter? Curiosity and the lingering tension between us tipped the scales, and I found myself walking away a few moments later. Ben was waiting just outside the pool area, leaning casually against a shaded wall, but his posture betrayed the same nervous energy I felt. "You came," he said, his voice low and charged. "I wasn't sure if I should," I admitted, though my legs had made the choice for me. He stepped closer, his eyes darker now, brimming with intent. "About what happened in the pool." His words trailed off, and he inhaled sharply before continuing. "I don't want to stop there." My heart skipped a beat. I had felt the same way, but hearing him say it out loud sent a rush of excitement through me. He reached for my arm, his touch light but searing. "I want more," he murmured, his fingers grazing my skin. "What about Alex?" I whispered, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to appear. Ben shook his head quickly, his voice firm. "Alex doesn't know, and trust me, he's not into this. He's just straight." The way he said it was so definitive, like it had been established long ago. I nodded, but a part of me couldn't help but wonder. "And if we told him? If we included him?" The suggestion came out softer than I intended, but I couldn't deny the thought's reckless allure. Ben's eyes widened briefly before he chuckled under his breath. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That's not him. This..." He gestured between us. "This is different." Somehow, that made it feel even more thrilling. Our secret, separate from Alex. Ben stepped closer, his breath warm on my neck. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "Come to my room, just the two of us." The promise in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that lingered in my thoughts long after he walked away. The rest of the day stretched painfully long. We spent the evening as a group, Alex as energetic and oblivious as ever, cracking jokes and planning the rest of his trip. But every time I caught Ben's eyes, my mind raced back to his whispered invitation. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the moment over and over, the feeling of his hand on my waist, his quiet confidence as he said tomorrow. What would it feel like to be alone with him, without the need for restraint or secrecy? By the time the next day rolled around, I was restless. Anticipation had built to a fever pitch, each hour dragging painfully toward noon when Ben texted me his room number. I knocked, nerves prickling under my skin, but when the door swung open, I froze. Alex was standing there, his face lighting up with a friendly grin. "Hey, come on in." He seemed relaxed, too relaxed. His hair was a mess, his cheeks slightly flushed, and a bottle of whiskey on the table explained the glazed look in his eyes. I hesitated, my pulse hammering as I stepped inside. Ben was on the couch, legs stretched out, but his expression was anything but casual. His eyes locked on mine with that same smoldering intensity, and the tension in the room felt almost suffocating. Alex flopped back into an armchair, gesturing toward the whiskey. "Help yourself, we've been killing time." Ben stood, walking toward me slowly, his voice low and calming as he leaned in. "Everything's fine," he murmured, his hand brushing my arm. "Alex has been drinking, but don't worry, he's cool." I wasn't sure what Ben meant by cool, but something about the way his hand lingered on mine reassured me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Alex seemed oblivious as he launched into a story about some embarrassing moment from their flight, but my focus was entirely on Ben. He guided me toward the couch, sitting down beside me, his body close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. Alex rambled on, his voice fading into the background as Ben leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear. "Don't worry," he whispered. "This is our moment. Just follow my lead." The words sent a spark through me, and as I glanced at Alex, still lost in his own world, I realized Ben had orchestrated this perfectly. Whatever came next, I knew I couldn't turn back now. I sat between them, Alex lounging lazily to my right, his glass of whiskey dangling loosely in his hand, and Ben on my left, his energy a stark contrast, intent and magnetic. The room was heavy with an unspoken tension, a quiet buzz that made every breath feel like a spark in the charged air. Alex seemed blissfully unaware, his gaze flickering between the TV and the amber liquid in his glass. But Ben was anything but. His hand rested lightly on my knee at first, a simple gesture that might have seemed innocent to anyone looking. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately, the heat of his touch seeping through the fabric of my shorts. I glanced at Alex, half expecting him to notice, but he only took another sip, his expression distant. I wasn't sure if he was too far gone to care or if this was part of some unspoken allowance. Ben leaned in, his lips brushing my ear. "I told you," he murmured, his voice low and filled with intent. "I want you." The words sent a thrill down my spine, and when his hand slid higher, brushing against bare skin, my breath caught. My pulse quickened, torn between the quiet thrill of his touch and the surreal presence of Alex just inches away. As Ben's fingers traced lines under my shirt, the sensation was electric. Every nerve in my body seemed to come alive, yet my eyes kept darting to Alex. His head lolled slightly to the side, his glass tipping but not spilling, his focus seemingly miles away. When Ben's hand slipped beneath the waistband of my shorts, I gasped softly, my heart pounding. I turned toward Alex, instinctively seeking his reaction, but he was unmoving, his chest rising and falling in an easy rhythm. Something about his nonchalance emboldened me, a daring thought crossing my mind. I reached out to Alex, my hand resting lightly on his chest. His breath was steady beneath my palm, warm and inviting. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away, and I leaned in closer, feeling the heat of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. At the same time, Ben's touch grew bolder, his lips finding their way to the side of my neck. The contrast between them, Alex's heavy stillness and Ben's searing intensity, sent a heady rush through me. The room seemed to shrink, the outside world fading into irrelevance. It was just us, a tangled mix of limbs and whispers, a collision of desire and recklessness. Ben's lips trailed down my chest, his mouth warm and insistent, pulling a shiver from deep within me. My hand moved instinctively along Alex's back, tracing the curve of his spine. He shifted slightly, murmuring something unintelligible, but didn't pull away. For a moment, the boundaries of reason blurred. Ben moved with purpose, his touch a command that left no room for doubt. I surrendered to the heat of the moment, caught in the exhilarating chaos of the forbidden. Time seemed to stretch and fold in on itself. Alex's steady breath, Ben's eager hands. It all became a whirlwind of sensation. There was no thought, no hesitation, just the raw, electric pull of the moment. When I finally leaned back, my body spent and my mind spinning, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. Alex was still there, a quiet presence, while Ben's satisfied smirk and the lingering heat of his touch told me this was far from over. Whatever boundaries had existed before had been crossed, and there was no going back. The overwhelming intensity of it all was almost too much to process. Alex remained oblivious, his body slouched in drunken surrender, the soft hum of his snoring a far cry from what was happening just inches away. His presence, passive and unaware, seemed to heighten everything. The fact that he had no idea, that he was so blissfully ignorant while Ben and I were tangled together in this reckless web of desire, made the experience all the more thrilling. Ben's mouth moved lower still, and each inch brought with it a surge of anticipation, of something wild and forbidden that I couldn't pull myself away from. It was as though time had slowed, the entire world outside of that room fading into nothing. The weight of Alex's proximity only made the stolen moments with Ben feel even more intense, more charged. Each touch, each movement became a whisper in the dark, intimate, dangerous, and intoxicating. I realized, somewhere in the haze of it all, just how far this would go. And yet I didn't want it to stop. The risk, the thrill of the secret, the closeness to Ben, everything about it was magnetic. There was no hesitation now, no second guessing. When I woke up the next morning, the room was bathed in the hazy light of dawn, casting soft shadows across the floor. The events of the night before lingered like a dream, intense, blurry, surreal. I could still feel the echo of Ben's touch, the heat of his body against mine, and the electricity that had charged the space between us. I glanced around, heart still racing, as the reality of the morning began to sink in. Ben was still asleep beside me, his arm draped lazily across the sheets, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. His presence was warm and comforting, yet there was a sense of finality in the air. This was a fleeting moment, a chapter that would never be revisited. Alex, however, was a different story. He sat up on the couch, rubbing his temples with a groggy expression, clearly nursing the aftermath of his drunken stupor. The empty whiskey bottle on the table was a silent testament to how much he'd consumed the night before. My stomach churned. Had he remembered anything? Had he felt something, even in his haze? My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the night, but one thing was clear. Alex had been too far gone to know anything. The panic that had gripped me at first began to subside as I watched Alex stumble to the bathroom, muttering about needing water. His obliviousness was both a relief and a strange sense of guilt. Ben stood beside me, blinking awake. I caught his eye, and there was an unspoken understanding between us. What had happened between us would never be spoken of again. It was a secret we would carry with us, forever tucked away in the corners of our minds, never to be shared with anyone. Ben slipped out of bed, pulling on his clothes with a quiet grace. He turned to me, his tired smile barely visible. "We're leaving today," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's been fun." His words held an unmistakable finality, and a sharp pang of regret tugged at my chest. I knew what he meant. Whatever had sparked between us, whatever reckless chemistry had ignited, was over now. A wild moment, a brief indulgence in the heat of passion, but now it was time to walk away. The thrill of secrecy, the fleeting connection, everything had already faded into the past. I didn't say anything as Alex returned to the room, chuckling and tossing a bottle of water onto the bed. Ben and I exchanged one last glance, wordless, yet saying everything that needed to be said. Alex, unaware, laughed off his hangover, making plans for the drive back home. The carefree attitude he carried was the exact opposite of the whirlwind of emotions I was caught up in. I gathered my things in silence, offering a quick goodbye to Alex, who didn't seem to notice the weight of the moment. There was nothing more to say. The secret we shared was one that would remain hidden forever. I stepped out of the room, feeling the cool morning air against my skin as I made my way back to my own space. The memory of those two strangers, of Ben and Alex, began to fade into the background, slipping into the recesses of my mind. I didn't look back as I walked away, knowing deep down that I would never see them again, and in a way that was probably for the best. The sun was already warm against my skin as I stepped outside. The salty breeze greeted me, a familiar comfort that brought me back to the present. I inhaled deeply, feeling the sea air fill my lungs. There was something oddly peaceful about the finality of it all. It had been a moment, an unexpected, reckless moment, that would stay with me forever, even if it was never spoken of again. I smiled to myself, the memory already beginning to settle like sand in the back of my mind, slowly fading but never truly disappearing. It was a secret I would carry with me for the rest of my life, a story that would remain untold, tucked away in the quietest corners of my mind. And with that, my vacation continued, the world around me moving forward while I carried the weight of the past few days as my own silent truth.